In the final hours before Queen Elizabeth II drew her last breath, the world believed history was quietly coming to its inevitable close. But inside Balmoral Castle, behind sealed doors and trembling voices, something happened that would fracture the royal family forever. Prince Edward heard it. He wasn't meant to repeat it. Yet what the Queen whispered to him in that fragile moment would ignite a truth so explosive it would rewrite everything. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The atmosphere inside Balmoral that day carried a strange, unspoken heaviness, as though every corridor, every closed door, and every quiet exchange between palace aides held a secret no one dared to name. Staff who had served the Queen for decades moved with careful urgency, their voices lowered, their expressions guarded. They had seen her in moments of strength, in moments of fatigue, and even in moments of private vulnerability, but never like this. There was something different in the air, something final. Yet beneath her physical fragility, there remained an unmistakable presence, her mind, sharp as ever, alert in ways that unsettled those closest to her. She was not drifting quietly into history. She was waiting. Waiting for something, waiting for someone. That someone was Prince Edward. The summons came without warning. It did not follow protocol. It did not include the usual formalities. Edward had not expected to be called alone, not at a moment when every second carried the weight of irreversible loss. Senior royals were present at Balmoral, yet somehow it was Edward, not the heir, not the future king, who was quietly requested at her side. Even those who delivered the message sensed its gravity, but did not question it. Edward himself felt it immediately. This was not routine, this was intentional. As he walked through the silent corridors toward her private chamber, an unexplainable dread tightened around him, not because he feared her passing, but because somewhere deep within him, he knew this moment carried meaning far beyond goodbye. When he entered, the room was still. The Queen's breathing was shallow, her strength visibly diminished, yet her eyes, those unmistakable eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of generations, were focused with unwavering clarity. She was weak, but she was not fading. She was present, aware, waiting for him. Edward approached slowly, unsure of what she needed, unsure of what he could possibly offer her in these final hours. But it became clear almost instantly that she had not called him there for comfort. She had called him there for something far more deliberate, something that had been decided long before that moment. She spoke quietly. So quietly that Edward had to lean closer, straining not just to hear her words, but to understand their meaning. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with urgency. She did not speak in vague reflections or sentimental farewells. She spoke with purpose, with certainty, each word measured, each word intentional. Edward felt his breath slow, his pulse heavy in his chest, as he realized he was not merely listening, he was being entrusted. Something was being placed in his care, something irreversible. Outside the room, Sophie remained close. Her presence had been constant throughout the Queen's final hours, steady and unwavering in ways that few others could match. She had not demanded attention. She had not sought recognition. Yet somehow she remained near, as though she instinctively understood that her role in these final moments mattered more than anyone realized. Staff noticed it. They noticed how the Queen's demeanor softened when Sophie was nearby. They noticed the quiet understanding that passed between them without words. And they noticed, too, how Edward, upon leaving the room, no longer looked the same. Because when Edward emerged, something inside him had shifted. He did not speak. He did not explain. His expression carried a weight no one could interpret, but everyone could feel. There was shock in his eyes, confusion, and something deeper, something that looked almost like fear. Palace aides, trained to observe without asking, recognized that whatever had passed between Edward and the Queen had not been ordinary. It had not been routine. It had been final. And though no one could yet understand what had been set into motion within those walls, one truth had already begun to take shape. An invisible change, subtle yet undeniable, had begun to alter the balance of everything the royal family thought it knew. What Edward heard that night wasn't merely a goodbye, it was a transfer of trust so profound that its consequences would soon send shockwaves through the monarchy. While the world focused on heirs and crowns, the Queen's quiet strength lay elsewhere in someone few expected. Sophie was never the loudest royal, never the most visible, and never the most powerful. But in those final days, she became something far more important. She became the Queen's constant, and as whispers turned to revelations, one terrifying possibility emerged. Sophie had been chosen long before anyone realized, long before the Queen's final hours at Balmoral, long before the tension that now clung to every quiet exchange within the palace. Sophie had earned something no title could grant, and no ceremony could formalize. It had not happened suddenly. It had grown slowly, quietly, through years of unwavering presence when others were distracted by expectation, duty, or ambition. Sophie had never demanded the Queen's attention. She had never positioned herself as indispensable. And perhaps that was precisely why she became so essential. Where others carried the weight of future crowns or past disappointments, Sophie carried something far simpler and far more powerful: consistency. Edward had seen it unfold over time, though he had never fully understood its significance until now. He had watched his wife move through the royal world with calm restraint, never seeking influence, never asserting importance, yet somehow becoming someone the Queen instinctively trusted. Their conversations often stretched longer than anyone expected. Their exchanges carried an ease that defied royal formality. There were moments Edward had quietly observed, moments where words were unnecessary, where a glance or a soft reassurance seemed to ground the Queen in ways no one else could. It wasn't favoritism. It was something deeper, something built not on obligation, but on belief. In those final days, that belief became unmistakable. As the Queen's physical strength faded, her circle grew smaller, access became more restricted. Conversations became shorter, but Sophie remained. She did not force herself into the Queen's presence. She was simply there, steady and unwavering, offering comfort without expectation. Staff noticed the difference immediately. They noticed how the Queen's tension eased when Sophie entered. They noticed how her breathing steadied, how her voice, though fragile, carried greater certainty when speaking to her. It was as though Sophie's presence reminded her not of what she was losing, but of what she had preserved. Edward noticed it too, and at first he saw it only as loyalty, the quiet devotion of a wife who respected the woman who had shaped their lives. But now, after what he had heard in that private chamber, after the whispered words that still echoed in his mind, Edward began to see those moments differently. Why? They were no longer simple gestures of affection. They were signs. Signs that something had been building beneath the surface for years, unnoticed by those who believed they understood the monarchy's inner workings. Sophie herself remained unaware of the deeper implications. Her grief was genuine. Her presence beside the Queen had never been motivated by anything other than love and respect. Yet there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Edward sensed something unspoken passing between them, something that existed beyond the reach of tradition or hierarchy. It unsettled him, not because he doubted Sophie, but because he realized the Queen's trust in her might extend far beyond emotional comfort. The monarchy had always functioned on structure, on clearly defined roles, on expectations shaped by centuries of precedent. But what Edward had begun to understand was far more unpredictable. Trust, when given in its purest form, did not always follow those rules. And the Queen, in her final days, had made choices not based on protocol, but on something far more personal. Edward felt it now with painful clarity. The bond he had once admired from a distance had never been ordinary. It had been intentional, carefully nurtured, quietly protected. And now, as the weight of the Queen's final whisper pressed heavier on his conscience, he realized that Sophie had never just been a comforting presence in the Queen's life. She had been something more, something chosen. But while Sophie's loyalty had earned her the Queen's affection, what Edward would soon learn suggested that affection had evolved into something far more powerful and far more dangerous. It was late. The castle had grown unnaturally quiet, as though time itself had paused. Then came the message that changed Edward forever. The Queen wanted him, alone, no witnesses, no interruptions. What happened in that private chamber would never be recorded officially, but Edward would carry its weight for the rest of his life. because in those fragile final moments, the Queen revealed something no one else was meant to hear. Edward had walked those corridors countless times before, yet that night they felt unfamiliar, heavy with an invisible pressure that slowed his steps and tightened his chest. No voices echoed, no footsteps followed. Even the air itself seemed to resist movement, as though the walls understood what he did not, that whatever awaited him inside that room would not leave him unchanged. His mind searched for reassurance, some explanation that could soften the dread rising inside him, but none came. The message had been clear. She wanted him, only him. When he reached the door, he hesitated. Not out of fear of loss, that inevitability had already begun its quiet approach, but out of something far more unsettling. He sensed purpose, finality, and when he finally entered, that feeling deepened. The Queen lay still, her body weakened by time, yet there was nothing fragile about her presence. Her eyes found him immediately, sharp and aware, cutting through the silence with unmistakable intent. This was not a woman fading into memory. This was a monarch preparing to leave something behind. Edward moved closer, his heart pounding with a rhythm he could not control. He spoke softly, unsure if she could hear him, unsure if she had the strength to respond. But then she spoke. Her voice was faint, barely more than a breath, forcing him to lean closer, closer than he ever had before, until the world outside that moment ceased to exist. Every word she uttered was deliberate, measured, chosen with precision that erased any doubt about her clarity. She was not confused. She was not drifting. She knew exactly what she was saying. At first, Edward did not understand. His mind resisted the meaning of her words, searching for some other interpretation, some safer explanation, but there was none. She repeated herself, slower this time, ensuring he heard, ensuring he understood, ensuring he would never forget. She was not asking him, she was entrusting him, and with that trust came a responsibility he had never expected, a burden that settled onto him with suffocating weight. Shock struck him first, then disbelief. His breath faltered as the implications began to unfold in his mind. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was not a passing remark born of emotion. This was a decision, final, irreversible, and she needed him to carry it forward. Her gaze remained fixed on him, searching his face for something understanding, perhaps, or acceptance. Edward wanted to respond, wanted to promise something, but the words refused to form. He was no longer simply her son. In that moment, he had become the keeper of something far more dangerous than grief. She reached for him then, her frail hand carrying more authority than any decree ever issued. It was not strength he felt, but certainty. And in that certainty, Edward realized there would be no one else to share this responsibility with. This was his alone. When he finally stepped away, the room felt smaller, suffocating in its silence. He turned back once, his heart unwilling to accept what had just passed between them, but she had already withdrawn into stillness, her expression calm, as though she had completed something long planned. Edward left the room in a state he could not control, his thoughts fractured, his sense of reality forever altered. Outside, the world continued without awareness, without understanding that everything had already begun to change. He did not speak. He could not, because he knew that what he carried now was not merely a memory, it was a truth powerful enough to fracture certainty itself. But Edward didn't yet realize that those whispered words would soon place him at the center of a royal storm, unlike anything the monarchy had ever faced. At first, Edward couldn't accept what he had heard. It seemed impossible, unthinkable. Yet the Queen had been unmistakably clear. Her final wish wasn't about titles or crowns, but about Sophie. She had named her, not symbolically, not sentimentally, exclusively. What that designation meant, and what it gave, Sophie would soon threaten to unravel decades of royal expectation and ignite a silent war behind palace walls. The words refused to settle in Edward's mind. They lingered there, suspended between reality and denial, replaying with relentless precision. He had spent his entire life understanding the monarchy as something governed by rules, by lineage, by inevitability. Nothing of true significance was ever decided in isolation, and certainly not in whispers that bypassed centuries of structure. And yet, That was exactly what had happened. The Queen, in her final conscious moments, had spoken Sophie's name not with affection alone, but with unmistakable authority. It had not sounded like a hope. It had sounded like a command. Edward had stood there, frozen, searching her face for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that might soften the meaning behind her words, but there had been none. Her clarity had cut through his disbelief with terrifying certainty. She knew what she was doing. She understood the consequences, and still, she had chosen Sophie, not shared, not alongside others. Exclusively. The weight of that decision settled heavily onto Edward's shoulders the moment he stepped away from her bedside. It was not simply the burden of knowledge, it was the burden of responsibility. She had not entrusted this truth to anyone else. Not the future king, not the advisors who shaped royal continuity. Him, that say, voice alone carried its own message. One Edward was only beginning to understand. She trusted him not just to hear her final wish, but to protect it, to defend it, to carry it forward, even if it shattered expectations that had stood unchallenged for generations. And Sophie did not know. Edward saw her in the quiet hours that followed, her grief genuine, her composure steady, despite the pain she could not conceal. She moved with the same quiet devotion she had always shown, unaware that the Queen's final act had forever altered her place within the monarchy. Edward studied her carefully, searching for any sign that she suspected what had been spoken. There was none. She had not asked for this. She had not positioned herself for this. And yet, somehow, she had been chosen. The implications stretched far beyond anything material. This was not about wealth, not about possessions. It was about something far more dangerous: legacy, influence, trust. The Queen had not simply given Sophie something to hold. She had given her something to represent, something that would exist long after titles passed and ceremonies faded. And Edward knew with growing dread that once revealed, it would not be accepted quietly, because the monarchy depended on perception, on predictability, on the illusion of seamless continuity. And this was neither predictable nor seamless. This was disruption in its purest form. Edward's thoughts spiraled as he considered the reaction of others. The questions, the disbelief, the anger. How could he explain it? How could he defend it? And more terrifying still, how could he deny it when he had been the one chosen to hear it? He felt trapped between loyalty to his family and loyalty to the woman who had trusted him with her final truth. There was no safe path forward, only consequences waiting to unfold. He began to understand that the Queen's whisper had not only given Sophie something, it had taken something from him. His certainty, his peace, his place within the fragile balance of royal unity. Because once this truth emerged, nothing would remain untouched. And as dawn approached, Edward realized that revealing this truth wouldn't just honor the Queen, it would expose fault lines within the royal family that had been buried for decades. When the Queen finally passed, the world mourned a monarch. But inside Balmoral, grief was tangled with something far more complicated. Edward carried a secret no one else fully understood. Sophie carried a quiet strength no one questioned, and somewhere between sorrow and silence, an invisible shift in royal destiny had already begun long before anyone outside those walls knew what had truly happened. The moment her passing became undeniable, the atmosphere changed in a way Edward would never forget. It was not sudden, it was not chaotic, it was controlled, measured, and eerily calm. Years of preparation had trained everyone within those walls to respond with precision, to move with dignity even as history came to an end. But Edward felt none of that control inside himself, while others stepped into their roles. He remained frozen in a moment no one else had experienced, replaying her final words again and again, unable to escape their meaning. His eyes found Sophie almost instinctively. She stood quietly, her composure intact but fragile beneath the surface. There was no performance in her grief, no attempt to shield herself from the emotional truth of what had been lost. Her pain was deeply personal, far beyond the formal sorrow expected of a royal farewell. Edward could see it in the stillness she carried, in the way she remained present even when others began to move forward with procedure. She had not lost only a monarch, She had lost someone who had trusted her in were. Yes, the world did not yet understand. Edward watched her carefully, his heart heavy with the knowledge she did not yet possess. She moved with the same humility she always had, unaware that the Queen's final act had bound her to something far greater than memory. Edward felt an overwhelming urge to speak, to release himself from the crushing burden of silence, but the words refused to come, not here, not now, because the moment he spoke them, nothing would remain the same. Around them, the machinery of the monarchy had already begun its work. Messages were sent. Protocols were sent. Protocols were activated. Statements carefully prepared to present unity, continuity, stability. Palace officials moved swiftly, ensuring that the transition would appear seamless to the outside world. Every detail was controlled, every word chosen to preserve the illusion of certainty. But Edward knew something they did not. Beneath the carefully constructed narrative, there was another truth waiting to emerge, a truth that could disrupt everything they were trying to protect. He felt it growing heavier inside him with each passing hour. Every interaction became more difficult, every silence more suffocating. He questioned himself constantly. Had he understood her correctly? Had he misinterpreted something that was never meant to carry such consequence? But deep down, he knew the answer. He had not misunderstood. Her voice, though fragile, had been unmistakably clear. She had chosen him for a reason. She had trusted him to carry forward something no one else could. And yet, fear held him back. Fear of how Sophie would react. Fear of how the family would respond. Fear of the fracture it might create within an institution built on unshakable unity. Edward had lived his entire life within the protection of royal order, where every transition followed predictable paths. But now he stood outside that certainty, whole, holding a truth that existed beyond protocol. He realized with growing unease that silence itself was becoming a decision, a choice that carried its own consequences. He began to understand that the Queen's passing had not only ended an era, it had begun something else, something quieter, something far more uncertain. Because while the world believed it was witnessing the closing of one chapter, Edward knew another had already begun, one written not in public ceremony, but in private trust. And with every moment he remained silent, that trust pressed harder against him, demanding to be heard. But secrets within the monarchy rarely remain hidden forever, and Edward's silence was already beginning to fracture. Days passed, then weeks. Edward said nothing, but silence became unbearable. Every public tribute, every carefully rehearsed ceremony, every controlled narrative felt incomplete because Edward knew the Queen's true final wish had not been revealed. He had been entrusted with something sacred, and with every passing moment, the pressure to expose it grew stronger. Until finally, Edward reached the point where silence was no longer an option. At first, he convinced himself that silence was the right choice, that protecting the monarchy meant protecting its stability, even if it required him to carry the burden alone. He had lived his entire life understanding the value of restraint, the necessity of preserving unity above all else. The monarchy survived because its fractures remained hidden, because its uncertainties were never allowed to surface. But this was different. This was not speculation or misunderstanding. This was her voice, her intent, her final act of will. And every time Edward heard public statements honoring her legacy, he felt the quiet, suffocating truth pressing harder against his conscience. He began to withdraw, not physically, but emotionally. Calm. Conversations felt distant. Words spoken around him seemed hollow, stripped of their meaning. He listened as others spoke confidently about continuity, about the future unfolding exactly as expected, and he felt an almost unbearable tension rising within him. They did not know. They could not know. And yet he did. He alone carried something that contradicted the certainty they believed in. It isolated him in ways he had never experienced before. Sophie noticed. She did not confront him immediately. She had always understood him in ways others could not, sensing shifts in his silence long before he spoke. She saw it now in the way he avoided her gaze at unexpected moments, in the pauses that lingered too long, in the quiet exhaustion he could no longer conceal. She asked gently at first, her voice carrying concern rather than suspicion. Edward offered reassurance. But even as he spoke, he knew she could see through it. Sophie had spent years beside him. She knew the difference between peace and burden, and Edward was carrying something heavy. Each day, his internal conflict deepened. He replayed the Queen's words constantly, searching for clarity, searching for permission to speak or justification to remain silent. But there was no escape from what he had been given. The Queen had not chosen someone else. She had chosen him. That choice alone carried responsibility that could not be ignored forever. He began to realize that silence was not protection. It was delay, and delay eventually would become betrayal. More than anything, he began to understand that Sophie deserved to know, not because of obligation, but because of trust. The Queen had spoken her name with unmistakable certainty. That certainty demanded recognition, yet the thought of telling her filled Edward with fear, unlike anything he had ever known. He feared the moment she would hear the truth. He feared the change it would bring, the shift it would create, not just within their family, but within Sophie herself. Because once spoken, those words could never be taken back. They would alter her understanding of her place, her identity, her future. And still, he knew he could not remain silent forever. The weight had become too great. The distance between what the world believed and what he knew had grown impossible to sustain. He began to see that honoring the Queen's final wish was not optional, it was inevitable. Her trust had not been given lightly. It had been given with expectation, and Edward understood now that his role was not to hide her truth, but to protect it by ensuring it was heard. But Edward had no way of knowing that revealing the Queen's whisper would unleash consequences none of them were prepared to face. When Edward finally told Sophie what the Queen had whispered, everything changed. Sophie didn't react with triumph. She reacted with disbelief, because what she had been given wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility that would forever alter her place in the royal family. And as the reality settled in, Sophie realized that the Queen had trusted her with something far more powerful than anyone imagined. Edward had delayed the moment for as long as he could, not out of doubt, but out of fear of the irreversible shift it would create between them. He had spent days watching her, studying her quiet strength, wondering if she already sensed the truth, waiting beneath his silence. But Sophie remained as she always had, steady, compassionate, grounded in humility. She had mourned not as someone expecting anything, but as someone who had simply loved and respected the woman they had lost. And that was precisely why Edward knew he could not protect her from the truth any longer. She deserved to hear it, not as speculation, not as interpretation, but exactly as it had been spoken. When he finally began, his voice carried a hesitation Sophie had never heard before. Edward was not a man easily shaken. He had spent his life adapting to expectation, maintaining composure even under scrutiny. But now, the weight of what he was about to say made every word feel fragile. He told her about the summons, the silence, the Queen's voice, faint but unmistakable, and then he spoke the words that had haunted him since that night. He told her the Queen had named her, exclusively, not in passing, not as comfort, but as deliberate choice. Sophie did not speak at first. Her stillness was not emptiness, it was absorption. Her mind struggled to reconcile the simplicity of her place within the monarchy with the enormity of what she was now being told. She had never seen herself as central to anything beyond her duty. She had never sought recognition beyond quiet service. And now, suddenly, she was being asked to accept that the Queen had entrusted her with something deeply personal, something that existed beyond tradition, beyond expectation. Her first instinct was disbelief, not because she doubted Edward, but because she doubted herself. Her voice, when it finally came, was quiet, not triumphant, not proud, but afraid. She understood immediately that this was not a reward. It was a responsibility. And responsibility within the monarchy was never simple. It came with consequences, with scrutiny, with questions that would never fully fade. Sophie's thoughts raced not toward what she had been given, but toward what it would mean for everyone else. How would they react? How would they interpret the Queen's final decision? She had spent years preserving harmony, avoiding attention, ensuring she remained a steady presence rather than a disruptive force. And now, without seeking it, she had become something else entirely. Edward watched her carefully, eyeing in her reaction the very reason the Queen had chosen her. There was no ambition in her response, no sense of entitlement, only humility and the quiet understanding that trust of this magnitude could never be taken lightly. In that moment, they both realized the truth extended far beyond personal emotion. The Queen had not simply expressed affection, she had defined legacy. She had ensured that something she valued deeply would survive through someone she believed would protect it without distortion. And Sophie, though shaken, understood. She understood that the Queen had seen something in her others had not. Something steady, something incorruptible, something capable of carrying forward meaning without seeking power from it. That realization changed her not into someone new, but into someone fully aware of her place in a story she had never intended to lead. But while Sophie struggled to accept her new reality, others within the palace were already beginning to sense that something irreversible had changed. The palace thrives on order, hierarchy, and control. But whispers began to circulate. Subtle glances, unspoken suspicions. Something had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Edward's demeanor had changed. Sophie's presence carried new weight, and while no official announcement had been made, the truth was already moving through the palace like an invisible current, threatening to expose the Queen's final decision to the world. It began with the smallest changes, the kind no formal record would ever acknowledge, yet impossible to ignore for those who lived within the fragile ecosystem of royal life. Sophie had not altered her behavior. She remained composed, respectful, careful, not to overstep the invisible boundaries she had always honored. And yet, the way others responded to her had begun to change. There was a new awareness surrounding her presence, a shift in tone, in posture, in attention. It was not overt enough to provoke confrontation, but it was unmistakable to those trained to sense imbalance. Edward, too, had changed. He had always been measured, steady, reliable in his quiet role. But now there was something else beneath his composure, a vigilance that had not existed before. His attention lingered longer, his responses carried an unspoken calculation. He positioned himself closer to Sophie in moments where distance would have once been natural, not out of fear, but out of instinct. He was protecting something, or someone. And those who observed closely began to notice. Within the palace, observation was its own form of communication. No one asked direct questions. No one voiced suspicion openly. But silence itself became charged with meaning. Palace officials, advisors, and family members alike began to sense that something had passed between Edward and the Queen in her final hours, something that had not yet been shared. They could see it in his restraint, in the careful way he navigated conversations that touched on legacy, on trust, on the Queen's final days. He revealed nothing, but his silence revealed everything. Sophie felt it too, not accusation, not hostility, but awareness. She sensed the subtle recalibration of perception around her, the quiet curiosity that lingered just beneath politeness. She had spent years existing within the monarchy without disturbing its balance. She understood its rhythms, its sensitivities. And now, without seeking it, she had become a point of quiet gravity. It unsettled her, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood how fragile royal equilibrium could be. One shift, one revelation, could ripple outward in ways no one could fully control. Edward recognized the danger before anyone spoke it aloud. He understood that the monarchy did not fracture, the Paris stay, rough confrontation. It fractured through uncertainty, through questions that lingered too long without answers. And the longer he carried the Queen's truth in silence, the more that uncertainty grew. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that he could protect everyone by waiting. But waiting had created its own consequences. People were beginning to sense that something fundamental had changed, even if they did not yet know what it was. The monarchy had always depended on perception as much as reality. Stability was not merely maintained through action, but through belief. And belief was beginning to waver. Edward felt the walls of silence narrowing around him. Every passing day made concealment more difficult. Every subtle glance, every unspoken question, every shift in behavior reminded him that the truth could not remain hidden forever. He had been entrusted with something profound, But now he faced a new realization that protecting the Queen's final wish might require exposing it, and soon Edward would face the inevitable moment when silence could no longer protect anyone, not even the monarchy itself. The Queen's final whisper wasn't about power. It wasn't about titles. It was about trust. She had seen something in Sophie that few others had, and in her final act, she ensured that Sophie would carry forward a piece of her legacy no crown could symbolize. Edward had exposed the truth, and in doing so, he had revealed not just a secret, but the Queen's final, deeply personal declaration. By the time Edward accepted what his role had become, he understood there was no returning to the life he had known before that moment at Balmoral. He had crossed an invisible threshold, one defined not by ceremony, but by responsibility. The Queen had not asked him to explain her choice. She had not given him instructions wrapped in reassurance. She had simply trusted him. That trust became his burden, but also his purpose. He was no longer just a witness to her final hours. He had become the guardian of her final truth. And in protecting it, he realized he was protecting something far more fragile than tradition. He was protecting the essence of who she had been beneath the crown. Sophie, too, began to understand that her life had been irrevocably altered, not in public spectacle, but in quiet permanence. There was no announcement, no proclamation, and yet everything was different. She carried herself with the same humility, the same restraint that had always defined her, but within her lived a deeper awareness. The Queen had not given her something material. She had given her belief in her judgment, belief in her strength, belief in her ability to carry forward something intangible yet enduring. Sophie did not wear this responsibility as recognition. She carried it as promise. For Edward, there was closure in finally stepping into the truth he had resisted for so long. The fear that had once consumed him began to dissolve, replaced by clarity. He had not been chosen by accident. The Queen had known him. She had understood his silence, his loyalty, his ability to endure weight without seeking relief. And in that understanding, she had entrusted him with something no one else could carry. Edward no longer saw himself as someone trapped by her final words. He saw himself as someone entrusted to preserve them. The monarchy itself, though unchanged on the surface, had begun its quiet adaptation. No public acknowledgement marked the shift. No official record reflected what had passed in those final moments. But within its inner circle, something fundamental had been redefined. Legacy was no longer confined solely to succession or title. It had become something more personal, more human. The Queen's final act had reminded those closest to her that true legacy was not measured in crowns, inherited, but in trust bestowed. Time moved forward, as it always did. Ceremonies continued, roles remained intact. Yet beneath the continuity lived a deeper truth, known only to a few. The Queen's final whisper had not disrupted the monarchy. It had strengthened its most fragile foundation, its humanity. Edward had honoured her by speaking. Sophie had honoured her by accepting. And together, they carried forward something invisible, yet indestructible, because in the end, the Queen's final words didn't just change Sophie's future, they forever changed how the monarchy would remember its greatest matriarch. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.